All right. Hey, everyone. So I'm Jeffrey, and aka Ember Screencast. And today we're going to be talking about how to build a CRUD app in 2016. I actually did a presentation like this before, but I realized a lot of it was outdated. So we're going to be focusing on what is different this time. And if you've seen some of my talks before, I want to set some expectations. You're probably expecting some of this, 100 slides, and a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. But this one's going to be a little bit different because there's just so much to say, and I didn't have much time to prepare it, to make it shorter. So, CRUD is create, read, update, and delete. Those are the 4 different things that you have to do in order to be able to interact fully with data. And say, for example, in a to-do app, the create would be creating a new item. The reading would be looking at the list and maybe even looking at each individual item. The update would be being able to edit it or check it. And the delete would be removing it from the list. That's a very simple example. We're going to go over a slightly more complicated example today, step by step. And if you want that, you can go here, and because that's where we'll be working from for most of this. And this is the finished app. All right, so if you want to, you can go to this and clone it, and we'll be working from the tags. So the first thing you have to do setting up your app is you have to connect to the server. And you can proxy it to wherever your server is. I'm using a Rails app in the backend, so it's localhost 3000. And then you have to import active model adapter. This in Ember Data 2.0 is a separate add-on, as you can see here. So you have to, it's been separated from Ember Data proper. So you import that, and then you extend it, and then you can have a namespace depending on how things are served over your server. And then you're connected to the server. You have to tell Ember what your data is going to look like. And this will be, for a simple case like this, just like Ember 1.0. Nothing you need to change here. And so what that'll get you is that'll just get you a blank screen. So I won't even show you that. Let's go to displaying the index. So first we create a route. And typically in Ember 1.x, we would create a resource here. But resource has been deprecated. And so we're going to be using only routes. And there are some implications of that that we'll go over later. And then to get the model, to get the data, we have to go create a monsters route. And then in the model, we will use the findAll method on store. This is the Ember Data 2.0 equivalent of using this.store.find. But without having a second parameter. So they've split it up into findAll and findRecord. And then down in the monsters template, we loop over the model, and we make sure to use the model as attribute rather than attribute in model, like we would sometimes do in Ember 1.x. And so I can show you what that looks like. Uh-oh. And we haven't built the show route yet. So it just looks like this. And I'll magically add some styling before we go to the next step, but that's not really that important. All right, so the next step is the MonsterShow route. So the index is one version of read, and showing is another version of read. And here we're going to make some more routes, and we've preemptively added the edit route. So we have monsters, monster, and show, and those are all nested. Now in Ember 1.x, we might have done a resource for monsters and a resource for monster, and that would have given the show the route of monster.show. But since we're using just routes, it doesn't reset that namespace. So it's going to be monsters.monster.show. And that's going to affect how we use our, how we nest our files. Such as here, routes/monsters/monster.js. If we had been resetting the namespace with resource, it would have been just monster.js. And then, once again, we have a slightly different find method. We have find record, which is the equivalent of Ember Data 1.0 having this, and, well, it would have the same parameters. It would just be find. And then we link to the monster show route, and we're linking to it in each of the monsters. And notice again, monsters.monster.show. And then we have an outlet to put the child routes in, and that is no different than it was in Ember 1.0. And we can look at this. We'll look at just this for now. So we have our improved styling, and we click on a link, and it takes us here. We have the ID and then show. And of course, we can just do some basic styling to make it look sort of like a real app. So we've completely covered the R part of CRUD. We can read the data. We need to go over creation, updating, and deletion. And we'll go over, I believe, yes, we'll go over deleting next, since that requires the smallest change. So here is fairly similar to Ember 1.x. There's really nothing you need to change here. If you're not familiar with this, then we have an action on this button, and this action is in the actions hash of the Ember controller. And yes, we are still using controllers. I know moving to routable components was a big part of the hype for Ember 2.0, but we don't have routable components yet, so we're using controllers still. And so we have destroy card on the actions hash, and this notation is part of the ES 2015 notation for methods. The equivalent would be having a colon here and then function. All right, and so we get the model, we destroy the record, and destroy record is thenable, it's a promise, and so after that destroy record has gotten back from the server, then we transition to the monsters route. And we can go ahead and see this in action. So I have a disposable monster prepared just for this occasion. And notice here, it will disappear. I'm sure you guys have all made stuff like that fairly easy. All right, so that's our destroy. We've got 2 of our letters of CRUD. Now let's update. So to update, this is where some interesting Ember 2.0 stuff comes in. So, of course, you have your link to the edit page, and we already have our edit page in the routes. But then we have Ember one-way controls, which is an add-on meant to make one-way inputs easier to create. And in Ember 2.0, we're moving towards one-way data flow, data down, actions up. And in this case, we're actually replicating a two-way input using one-way inputs, but there's a lot of flexibility that you have once you have this construct. So we're using the one-way input component, and we're feeding it the value, And that's the value that is read one way by that component. It doesn't automatically mutate back up when you change something. To do that, we have the update property. If you're using a plain input tag, then this would be done by onInput. But here they call it update. And so a little explanation about what this does. So the mute helper is, it takes a property and it turns it into an object that has both the current value of that property and a method for updating that property. And then it can combine with the action helper. And so if you have a mute helper in an action helper, what it'll do is it'll take that method for updating it and it'll stick it onto the actions hash of the controller or the component that you're currently in. And so it's creating a new action and sticking it up here on this hash for the controller. And this new action, whenever you update, it'll call that action and it'll update that value. Here it's model.name. So that is how you replicate two-way binding with one-way bound inputs. So we have that, and we have our save button, which calls up here, and you get the model, you save it. When the promise returns, you transition to the show route. And we can see this in action. And we can change something, we'll level him up, and hurrah, the change stuck, even if we reload. All right, and so now we've gotten, wait, nope, I almost skipped over this. So we can read, update, and delete. Now we want to be able to create new ones. So this one is a little bit different because if we just created it when we went to the new route, then we would have a blank thing hanging off the end here, and we don't want that. So what we're going to have to do is when we call save, we're going to create a record then and not before. And so we're going to have to do a little bit of contortions. We're going to create a new model hash, which is just a blank hash at the start. And here, down here, where we have our almost exactly the same as the edit handlebars, except we're using new model instead of model. So in update, it had been handed the Ember data model. In new, it's handed a blank hash. And it still works pretty much exactly the same. The action and mute helpers still work. And then in our save action, we create the record from the new model. And then, of course, we set the new model to blank so that when we come back, it's not having all our old data. And then we save it, and after that's returned from the server, we transition to the show route. So we can see that in action. And grab that real quick. And we have created a new monster. So this is these are the 4 operations that you need in order to be able to meaningfully interact with data. But we're not quite done yet because, as we noticed before, this, the edit route and the new route, their handlebars are extremely similar. So this won't require any changes. This won't make any changes in how this looks, but it'll just make our code better. And we'll also get to have a sneak preview of the subject of Alex's talk. All right, so first we're going to make a component to just stick handlebars in. And we're going to, you'll recognize this code by now, most likely. this is the handlebars of our component. And here in edit and new, we just replace all that with a monster form. And we'll be feeding one of them the model and the other the new model. And notice currently it's just basically a template. So we're keeping the save button on the edit and new handlebars. But we can also send that action down. And we do that through closure actions. So here we have the action save that we're sending down into the component as save. And so what this does is it takes an action from the actions hash and packages it up and sends it down. And it has to be on the controller and the component. It can't be on an action from the router. That's something that bites people when they first try to do this. It has to be on the controller or component. So you're sending that down, and it's on the adders hash. And so here in the component, you have the save button, and it calls this in the component. And then you have this on the adders hash, the save method that you've passed down. And we're not using this to its fullest extent yet. You can, because you're passing down the function and calling it, if it's a thenable function, then you can have a promise chain here, possibly even with multiple functions that you've passed down. And Alex will tell us much more about that. And so that is your basic CRUD app built in January 2016. Are there any questions? Yes?
So going back to the first time you were talking about basically back to the mute helper, I'm not using that in my stuff yet, so I don't know how it works. So can we go back to the action mute helper?
Yes.
And you said, so I get how the action helper works, where it sticks that on the actions hash.
So that was edit, I think. Yes, so I don't completely entirely understand this. I'm amalgamating some stuff I found on various guides. So the mute helper, it takes something and it has the current value. It takes a property and it turns into an object that has both the current value of that property and a method for changing that current value. And so it has that, and action has some machinery where, like, if it recognizes that it's been passed one of those objects, it can work with it in a special way that will stick it up on the actions hash of the host controller component.
So that component has a method called update that happens when you click the update button, or the save button?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, it happens when you basically change anything in that input. When that input changes,
on type.
yeah, on type. So I guess I didn't demonstrate this as much. So actually, the thing I'm about to show is a reason why people like one-way components instead of two-way, because then you don't get this change here whenever you change stuff. But we are emulating a two-way bound component with our one-way bound component. And so anytime you change something there, it updates. Yeah?
So why should we be using that instead of just two-way binding?
So there's some cool stuff you can do if you if you use the plain inputs, then you can do it instead of on input, you can do on blur, which means that instead of it changing every time you type, it just changes when you unfocus. And so that's a simple and probably pretty common use case because, for example, you don't want a validation firing when it's not when they're not finished typing.
You should see the pretzels that Charles and I have had to build to try to do things like formatting credit card input. That because you have to tear apart two-way binding into one-way bindings. If you can't, did we do that in that training? I can't remember if that was part of the training. It was horrible. So I'm glad we don't have to teach people to do that anymore, because you basically have to break Ember's. You can set the bindings up, and you say like Ember binding one way, blah blah blah. But you have to basically break Ember's binding system in order to insert yourself into that process, do things for form input like formatting, or maybe somebody types something and you want to parse it before it goes back and becomes a part of the model. You want to like reformat it into money or something like that. So a lot of times you want to be able to insert yourself into that process, and that was very painful and had some surprising. Two-way binding had some surprisingly painful results. So Ember is basically backing away slowly from the concept of two-way binding almost entirely.
Yeah. Do you know if it's being completely deprecated for 3.0?
No idea.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know where else. Like Ember Object has a lot of bindings and stuff that happen under the hood. So I would imagine that would be very difficult.
Yeah.
But as far as getting stuff onto screen and binding to templates, it's going to be a lot more one-way stuff.
Yeah.
Is there a way of doing the same sort of thing with the mute helper, but on the controller level? I guess I'm not as used to like views modifying something on the controller. Would there be a way to like basically set those actions in a similar type of way, but on the controller level?
So like make a separate action for each input?
Yeah, like a shortcut for making an action for each of the inputs.
That's what the action and mute are. Yeah.
I was going to mention, I think you can kind of combine the action helper that like takes it from the controller and the action helper that puts it on the action hash kind of together. Like, I did it before, so I know it at least worked once.
Okay. So like have a action and then another action below it?
Like, so you can avoid having like the action, like avoid the, like in your last example where you had to save and then component, you can avoid having that
By injecting it into the action hash itself?
yeah, by using the action.
Oh, by like doing action and action save on the button?
Yeah.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
Thank you. I saw another hand. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, do you want to go first?
Yeah. Just to keep it from doing that, two-way binding on blur. I feel like one-way input, it has that update key.
Yeah.
I feel like it should have an enter key, to where if you hit enter or blur out, that's when your model.name gets mutated.
Right. So one-way input is an interesting add-on. So the reason they did it, so it fixes one big problem with input helpers, the plain ones, namely that when you type in the middle, it automatically sends you to the front of it or the back of it, whatever, the last character. And then obviously if you want to edit something in the middle, that's not very nice. And so it fixes that bug. It also does there's some verbosity in the input that is not great, and they eliminate it. But I can't figure out how to do an on blur correctly with them. They have key bindings, so you can hit enter and it will do something, but if you click outside of it, or if you hit tab, I mean, you can bind a tab, but by the time the default has done, you're in a different thing, so it doesn't fire for your current thing, it fires for the next thing.
Okay.
Right, but on the input, the plain input, the one with the bugs, you can do an on blur. And if you're doing on blur, that bug doesn't show up.
So you mentioned about the resource and the route stuff. I completely missed all of that. Like, not like in the talk. I meant like the whole discussion about deprecating it.
Yeah.
Do you have any like? Do you know like the backstory on that? Like, is there like pros and cons to like removing it?
I don't know the exact backstory. I presume it's something about not having as many namespace collisions. If someone knows more.
I know they also discussed it because it was confusing. People didn't know what the hell the difference was between a resource and a route was. Like,
Well,
right.
Changing what the differences were.
they had similar responsibilities.
Yeah,
Cool.
I think there is a reset namespace property on a route though, if you want to still not have like
Right.
Yeah, you can pass it.
I forgot about
Yeah. Yeah, I'd assume it also has something to do with pods that makes that easier, but that's completely unsubstantiated. All right, so if you want to know more about this, I have an aptly named CRUD 2016 app on GitHub, and in the latter half of February, some videos will be coming out about it on ember.screencast.com. All right.